Good afternoon and welcome to Philanthropy Impact's Walk in My Shoes member series, where we explore topics that are useful to you and your clients as they embark on their purpose-driven wealth strategies and donor journeys. Today's session is focused on succession planning. I'm looking forward to this one, having had a teeny little bit of experience of this topic myself in my career as a philanthropy consultant. My name is Sophie Zahanik and I am the Director of Membership and Development here at Philanthropy Impact and the person to talk to if you'd like to know more about our training and how to make the most of your membership with us. I will share my email in the chat or at the end of the session for those watching the recording. As always, we will keep this discussion strictly to 30 minutes, although I'm sure it could go on for a lot longer. So it will go quickly, but we encourage you to ask the chat, to use the chat to introduce yourself, have your say and pose questions to our panel. Please make sure to select everyone so that all can see and we can keep the conversation flowing. Chairing this discussion today is our member, and I hope you don't mind me calling this, a philanthropist, Lauren Holmes, trustee of the Family Foundation, the Helvellyn Foundation, is that right?
Yeah.
And joining Lauren, we welcome our members, Catherine Grum, who's partner and head of family office at BDO, and James von Simson, who's the director of investment management at Tilney, Smith and Williamson. Thank you all for joining us, and I will now hand over to Lauren to make a start. Thank you, Lauren.
Great, thank you, Sophia, for inviting me. I guess I won't spend too long reintroducing ourselves, and I think we'll learn quite a lot about each other as we go through. So I might just jump in with a question to start off. And I want to try and do this in a kind of chronological order. So let's see how I get on. So Catherine, if I can start with you. At what age or life stage do you think it's best to bring in the younger generation to conversations around philanthropy and impact investing? And then I guess maybe it would be a different answer to the question, in your experience, what is the typical age that you see the younger generation coming into these conversations?
Thank you, Lauren. So a great first question. Yeah, start at the beginning and move through. My perspective is that it's incredibly valuable when you're trying to do something as a family enterprise that you intend to span multiple generations. So whether that's family business, family philanthropy, family office, really you want to start engaging the younger generations as soon as you can, because it's much better if it's a progressive journey, their sort of awareness and involvement, rather than surprise on the day they turn 21 or 30 or 40, whatever the case may be. And of course, then you just look at age appropriate ways to involve them. So if you're talking to young children, you could be sharing what you do as a family around philanthropy, or sharing where philanthropy has played a role in your succession planning and where assets you may have inherited yourself have come through. And also you can talk to them about what they're seeing in the world, what their thoughts are on that. There's often now initiatives through schools around philanthropy. So there's lots of ways in which you can begin to engage them. In terms of engaging them then in what you as a family are doing, it's a great thing to be talking about around the family dinner table, because it's a way, if you want something to be successive and to be part of a family over multiple generations, then sharing the background and history and why the family have got into it, what the family's values and perceptions are, and sharing those stories that really bring it to life. And again, that there's no age limit on doing that. If you lay the foundations, then hopefully you'll have younger family members who are engaged, they're interested, and they'll be learning as they participate in all these discussions, so that as soon as they can start to play their own roles in it.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Like,
I would say that, sorry, I was just to add to that to say that obviously we'd all like the children we bring up to be wonderful, thoughtful, empathetic people, but children are also children. So trying to explain the concept of charity and philanthropy to them, they'll nod and say, I understand, but they won't necessarily stop to think. And one of the things to consider is taking something that they are passionate about and seeing how you can relate it. So one conversation I had with a client who wanted to involve their children in this discussion, but couldn't get an engagement with them, is they were all very keen on sports. And so we went through to the sports teams that they were very passionate about, and found out those sports teams had their own charitable endeavours. And so then, the parents said to the children, we would like you to talk about what your sports team does in the community to the rest of the family, to bring in the idea of the connection between something they do care about and something their parents would like them to start to care about a little bit more. So there are always really useful ways that are not necessarily the most obvious to bring it into the conversation, because sort of presenting to children, right, now we want to talk about what the family does here, they're not always going to engage when you want them to engage.
Yeah, certainly. Just to sort of build on that, if it feels like a lecture and something that's very one way, then that's not going to be effective. Any opportunities you have to make it much more practical, or even to gamify it and to turn it into a competition. Or I've seen certainly really successful families where they've asked the children to come up with their own causes, and they've gone out and researched things that they're personally really interested in. And when you can then engage them to understand, well, why did you pick this? What did you find out? What did you learn in that process? Certainly when they're a bit older, again, that they're going to learn a lot more through than you telling them how it should be done or how you would have done it.
Yeah, no, all really interesting. Kind of see it as a continuum that can start at a really young age, and then those little tips and tricks almost about connecting it to them. I mean, so those are kind of, to me, sounded like examples of when the older generation are trying to sort of bring the younger generation in. Have either of you had any experience of when actually the younger generation are ready to get going and the older generation are kind of not at the point where they're wanting the younger generation to be that involved?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are lots of families where the speed of change and the time at which the older generation are ready to let go or to make space, and the younger generation are kind of chomping at the bit, that can be a real challenge. And the starting point there is to have open discussions where possible as a family, because if it feels like the older generation are controlling and deciding everything, then it can feel very difficult and frustrating as a younger generation. You have to kind of balance the dynamics of that sort of a conversation, because what you don't want is it to feel very threatening to the older generation or very critical of what they've done so far. So where possible, if you can have discussions where you can find common ground or common causes that both can get behind, I know that makes it a lot easier to then start to look at where the next generation, the sort of younger family members, can start to play a role. And actually I've seen that quite effective during COVID, when, for example, one family business I know, one of the younger family members was really concerned about giving access to funds within the community, and was able to approach the family and actually get some leeway, I guess, and some support and some both financial and more mentoring support to enable him to look at solutions that he could put into place himself. And that really obviously had an immediate benefit for what he was trying to do locally, but for him and his role within the family, it actually helped him to, I guess, increase his status, not quite the right word, but his positioning within the family, his role within the family. And they started to look and understand and see him differently from the child that he had been previously.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and as to say, to add to that, this is quite broad brush, but traditionally people thought of charitable giving and maybe philanthropy as something that was involved in their estate planning. And this has then evolved on to people thinking it's something that they will focus on in their retirement, when they have the time and energy to focus on giving back from the success of their life's work. But one thing that's becoming more prevalent with next generations is a desire to give as you live. And so not waiting until retirement, actually it being an active part of the decisions you make throughout life. And I think one of the key things is that when younger generations are chomping at a bit to engage in it, they should have this conversation with the older generations, because the older generations might not have thought they cared about it at the moment. And so it's always the answer to most of these questions, why people just need to have more conversations. Yeah,
I think that's a really good point on both of those things. One, from my personal experience, the Helvellyn Foundation. Helvellyn is a mountain in the English Lake District, and that's kind of our common, the outdoors and wildlife is sort of our common theme, and that's how we've kind of brought ourselves together. through lots of conversations, as you say, Jane. I don't know if we can just touch on the difference you're seeing in your roles between kind of the older generation and then millennials who are kind of, 26 to 40, and now I guess Gen Z are coming into your work as well. What are the differences you're seeing in kind of values and interests? James, you've already mentioned the kind of, giving now rather than waiting till later. Is there anything else you're seeing that's kind of notably different between the two generations? Go on, James.
Yes, and also within the generations. I mean, it's sort of generally said that older generations tend to have a more local focus, and because of the greater understanding of global issues now, that younger generations tend to have a slightly, I don't want to say grander, but broader focus. So certainly speaking to a lot of clients who have historically given, they tend to give to local causes within their community, quite a lot to their schools and universities, particularly if they've had a fantastic experience from them. They're wanting to share that with a wider range of people. And that's very, very valuable giving. But other generations are caring about not what happens to their children, but what happens to someone else's children they never met on the other side of the world. Now, that's, again, talking very broad brushstrokes here, because it depends on the people, but there's definitely a broader focus. I think one of the other changes is and this isn't a new thing, this is something that's happened over the last 20 odd years, that moving away from the sort of slightly more traditional checkbook giving, or of sending off perhaps once a year when they're doing the tax returns the money to the causes that they might have historically supported, to a desire to more actively engage, and which is on one hand fantastic, but on the flip side of this, and we might come back to the later point, but I suppose one of the other side problems is that there's also, this leads into a greater level of expectation of feedback from the causes they support. And this is definitely something, the reason I bring it up is because it's been a bit of an issue with the founder I'm speaking to, where the next generation almost need to be reminded that they're partners in the cause they're supporting, and turning up to say, hi, I'm enthusiastic and I've got money, that's great, but they're speaking to people who have been focused on this for decades. And that there's the slight danger of the immediate, back to comment I made earlier about sort of gamification, the immediacy of information availability in other spheres doesn't necessarily translate as easily to the sort of philanthropic and charitable sector.
Yeah, that's certainly something that I've seen. I think it partly stems from, it feels like a greater sense of urgency with the younger generation. So combined with any of those who are the entrepreneurs who have built and made their money, if they're in kind of millennial generations or below, it's likely that they've made their money through tech or something like that in order to have generated a significant amount early on in their careers. And so both the urgency and kind of the business environment, if they're coming from that background, they do expect things to turn around and to happen, and impact also to be seen and to be valued more quickly. And I think understanding, getting the balance there, because they actually, particularly some of the entrepreneurs as well, they bring some really valuable ideas and concepts with them. Again, it's not just writing a check, but it's making sure that they're able to input in a way that is generative overall, rather than causing clashes. The other thing that I notice is a bit of a difference is the older generations who were philanthropic, it tended to be kind of a barbell approach. So they had whatever was generating the wealth over here, whether it's business, investment portfolio, and then they had the philanthropy over here, and they were kind of disconnected. Whereas now there's much more of a desire to make sure everything is coherent. So there's a family I'm working with at the moment, for example, where the father, the business founder, had the business and a charity that the causes were aligned to what he was doing from a business perspective. But his son, who is now brought into the business, said, great, well, what you're doing with the charity is all very well, but actually we also need to be making changes within the business in order to make sure, again, that there are sort of environmental themes with the charity, but also making sure that they're kind of walking the talk with what they're doing in the sort of wealth generation side.
Yeah, and there's kind of like, do you often find that philanthropy is the kind of entry point for the younger generation to get involved, and then would move on to those conversations potentially around impact investing, investing more generally, or, you know, making changes in a family business? Is philanthropy generally kind of like a gateway, I guess, to those bigger conversations?
It can be, and often as advisors, we encourage, well, one of the reasons we encourage philanthropy, definitely not the only or sole one, but it is a great way to start to engage younger family members, helping. There's so many benefits aside from the actual purpose that you're supporting. There's the education, seeing how our money goes and thinking about its application, doing the research, potentially if you've got a family foundation, working collaboratively with other members of the family, which will all be really useful skills for anyone who does then want to be involved with wider aspects of what the family has on. But it also depends a bit on the levels of interest and the stage at which each of those are at. Yeah. In some families, the foundations are actually very mature, and it's quite difficult for younger family members to get involved. And it's seen as almost a status of the older family members. There's one family I'm working with at the moment, which, you know, the trustees are very senior family members, and they're actually getting a bit disjointed from what the younger family members see and have as their vision. But the younger family members are much more involved actually in the business in that case, and in social impact sort of related spheres of the business. I'm trying to be careful what I say, so I'm not breaking confidences, but so it will depend. And one of the best ways to guarantee success is to find the areas where there's a connection and an interest, because people are going to be much more engaged then.
Yeah, I'm just seeing the comment that Jess has posted in the chat with the quote from one of Philanthropy Impact's newsletters. If philanthropists encourage charities to adopt a culture of excessive outcome measurement, they will inadvertently erode the ability of charities to experiment, fail, then succeed. I mean, I am a philanthropist. I also work for a charity, so I can fully understand and appreciate that the pressure that charities are under. And certainly we try not to put on extra pressure. We sort of, you know, take it upon ourselves to do the research, the due diligence, everything we want to know in advance. And charities already provide so much information. So yeah, it's a really good point.
Just building on that is that it's because dare I use a slightly lazy term, the digital native generation is so used to, first of all, seeing immediate information for what they want, but also being able to play around with that information. And so some conversations we've had with clients and their children, the children want to say, well, if we give this, what does it lead to? How can we change this? And on one hand, these are valuable questions because you don't want to be giving into a black hole where you don't know what's happening. But it's that point that it's not that the charities aren't giving the information because they don't want you to have it. It's that actually some of these things aren't as scientific as people might want it to be. And actually, so it kind of feeds back to the last 18 months, is that actually unencumbered giving is some of the most valuable you can do in certain situations. And people want to say, no, I will only give more, or I will give this amount, but I'm going to give you a little bit to start off with to see what you do with it. I can understand why people might start with that approach, but they don't necessarily realize, without being properly advised, the damaging effect that can have on relationships. And actually then feeding back to this sort of comment earlier on about investments is that this all does slightly come down to and where philanthropy and succession planning kind of sit side by side, it is also a question of I don't want to use the term power, but different family members will have different responsibilities. And where you do have a more established giving structure, which is perhaps linked to the feelings of prestige of one generation, actually being able to involve the younger generation in the family investments around impact investing and ESG is a way of bringing them in, making them feel like they're having an impact on their own family's giving, without necessarily changing the other structures of the family. So, you know, there are a lot of different levers and dials can be turned to help different peoples in different situations of family dynamics find the bit where the generations can be engaged, rather than being forced to or being excluded to when they want to be involved.
Yeah, and James, just picking up on that, I think the point about its role within succession planning is really key, because people tend to think of succession planning as transferring legal ownership and assets. And that is such a small part of, for a large generative family, what succession planning actually involves. It's understanding the legacy and working out how to make the next generation can make, and future generations as well, can make a success of that legacy, and the roles people play within the family, and how they get the experience and the opportunity to play those is actually a fundamental part of succession planning. And it's why it just doesn't work if it's kept at that senior generation and it's all done behind closed doors, because then the younger generations feel it's something that's been done to them, and they don't have the ability to influence it and add direction and colour. And if it's going to be what potentially shapes and certainly hopefully has a positive impact on them and their future lives, then it's, when you think about it like that, it seems strange that they're not involved at all in the process. And I think, as advisors, it is incumbent on us when we're having those conversations to make sure that, where appropriate, that the wider family is involved in those conversations. And again, it depends on the age and stage of all those involved, and you're going to have a different involvement if you've got kids who are minors, clearly, from adults in their 40s. But nonetheless, I think it's really important to consider how they can be involved and influence, and at least their opinions sort.
Just add on top of that is that I think one thing as advisors is one thing we need to be aware of is the danger of when one generation is trying to enforce responsibility on the next generation. And sometimes they're aware that that's not the right thing to do around the investments of the family business, and so therefore they try to enforce responsibility around philanthropy. And even if something simple as having established family foundation, that suddenly the next generation, you're now all trustees, you're now responsible for these trustees aren't aware they have data protection requirements. They have so many roles, which on one hand with good advisors isn't complicated, but to simply force that onto people and expect them to actually then be excited and engaged by the whole thing it may work, but history has suggested it's perhaps not the optimum approach. And I do think slightly softening that positive intention with perhaps bad methods approach from some generations to the next is one of the roles as advisors. Instead of reacting to things, it's where we can be more proactive.
Yeah, they're all very interesting and things I can relate to very well. There was one question which I guess is slightly takes us away from what we've just been discussing, but conscious of time, I was very curious about is what currently are the kind of training or level of training that professional advisors are required to do in terms of counselling, kind of coaching techniques, given that these conversations, as I've certainly experienced, are very personal, very emotional. I actually don't know. So you could probably enlighten me on that. And is it enough, do you think, to deal with the complexities we're talking about within families?
Well, there's probably a very short answer in that. Obviously, it depends on the professional advisor that you're engaging with, but I'm not aware of. So by my background, I trained as a private client lawyer. I've worked in wealth management. I've worked for trust companies, and I now work for an accounting firm. So in none of those roles was there any, at a kind of professional body or level, any formal requirements. Certainly there was degrees of awareness around particularly vulnerable clients, and those tend to be more sort of the elderly or those with learning impairments and things like that. But more generally, I think it's such a valuable and important skill of an advisor, and yet people will be trained ad infinitum in their technical specialism, and then it's up to individuals and firms to see what additional support there is available to have these conversations. I know I certainly I'm involved with an organisation called the Purposeful Planning Institute, and it's a US-based organisation, but there are some international members as well. And so for me, that's where I've got a lot of the support, and they have members who are coaches, who are psychologists, so all sorts of different ones, and many people who work as sort of family business consultants will have a degree of awareness and training again around sort of family dynamics and things like that. But certainly your typical professional advisor doesn't have a whole degree in counselling, for example. But I think the final point I would say is that most do understand where families are or individuals may be in a traumatic situation, so kind of the hard line when to get help. But then it really depends on the advisor you're working with. James, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, just to say that I think a number of advisors are put off because they're concerned about entering into a realm of emotions, and they don't feel they're necessarily, they might have a great IQ, but they're worried about their own EQ, and they're not sure they want to open this door in case it leads to somewhere where they don't feel prepared. And I'm not saying this because I know John's listening in right now, but having gone through the Philanthropy Impact training, there was nothing on that that totally shocked me, but I was amazed with how it impacted on the framing that I brought certain things into conversations. So even though investment managers, wealth planners, private client lawyers, tax advisors will have a lot of conversations around this with their clients, it's incredibly helpful when there are organizations, and I am saying this as a very happy person who's gone through the whole thing, which is the reason why I'm involved, people like Philanthropy Impact who are bringing it all together to give a framework, to bring the different parts together to help with the communication side. Because yes, there are some very difficult families and some very difficult family situations, but actually there's a lot you could do at the very small end, which can then compound in family decision making later on.
Yeah, and I think contrary to perhaps the thought when you're framing the question about people delving in too deeply into these sensitive issues, I think there's much more, as James said, of a reluctance, and I think that's true of conversations around philanthropy more generally, because at the moment there is no real sort of professional accreditation around philanthropy, and as you know, people who come from a professional background, you have it trained into you. If you're a lawyer, if you're a tax advisor, if you're an investment manager, that you can only stay within your sphere of expertise. That if there's no kind of formal accreditation around philanthropy, people are often worried to ask questions, and then they do clients really a disservice, because there's an awful lot that can be gained from a few questions and some good listening.
Well, I had many questions left to ask, but I can see John has popped up on screen, so I will leave it there for now. Thank you both, James and Catherine.
James, Catherine, that was terrific. Lauren, thank you very much for chairing this. You're right, there's a lot still left to be discussed, so maybe we'll put on a full webinar a little later this year. So we'll be back in touch around that. This whole area of dealing with family dynamics and multi-generations can be very complex. And I think, James, thank you for mentioning the training, because our specialty is in teaching advisors how to talk to their clients about their values, their ambitions, their motivations. And in doing so, I think that helps multi-generations actually understand each other. Because, you know, we've seen situations where it's led to family breakups, and we've seen situations where it's actually been super positive. So I'm going to ask each one of you for 30 seconds, final words of wisdom, and we'll start with Catherine.
So first one would be, yes, if you haven't already done the Philanthropy Impact training, I'd second everything James has said. It's really valuable, and actually running through those case studies. And I think more generally, going back to the point I was just making, don't be scared of asking your clients what their views are, what's important to them, and bringing philanthropy into a discussion proactively. If the clients don't want to talk about it, they'll tell you, but more often than not, you're just going to find out more about them and what drives them, deepen the relationship, and hopefully open up avenues where you can help them further.
Catherine, thank you. Thank you for those kind words. I would like to point out that we have not bribed the two speakers around this at all. James.
I was to say the final thing is that, whether it's advisors or the families we're speaking to, as well as giving, it's important to give well. And one of the easiest ways to move towards that direction is around intentionality. It's not about having the right answers. It's about intending to discuss with family members, intending to research what you're interested in, intending to put a plan around, be it the tax side. I know we sort of don't like to bring tax in when we're talking about philanthropy, but it is an important consideration about sort of magnifying the impact you can make, or even just speaking to financial advisors and ask them to go through some cash flow modeling to work out exactly where in your life and at what stage you have the ability to give. And that's why you don't have to wait until you're retired or part of your estate planning, because there might be points that you know, around your life where there is the opportunity to start building up some giving. So intentionality, I think, is really important.
Thank you. Lauren, from a counseling perspective, you've done that. I think what happens is that if someone really needs quite intense counseling, any advisor would help to the people to network. But sort of this basic stuff around interrelationships is really important to have those discussions. And so Lauren, final 30 seconds of words of wisdom to you.
Okay. Well, yeah, I would just reiterate that certainly from my experience, that emotional and personal side of succession planning is so important, if not more important than your knowledge of philanthropy and investing. So for me, for advisors, I would say keep learning around the kind of things that Philanthropy Impact are doing and offering. And then for any older generations who might listen to this, listen to your younger generation and just keep having those conversations, as we mentioned earlier. And any younger generations, the same goes. Listen to your older generation and keep talking. And I think that is how things are worked out. So yeah, that would be my final words.
Lauren, thank you very much. Catherine and James also, thank you. It was really brilliant. Over to you, Sophia.
Thanks, John. I just want to add, before I tell you about what we're doing next week, that we have a few people who work in fundraising on the call today. And it's really important that they hear this as well, because I think from a point of view of trying to engage families in philanthropy, they understand the mechanisms and the choices that have to be made, that it's really great to hear. So thanks from that cohort as well, not just the professional advisors. So next week, thank you all. That was so interesting. It really was. Next week, we are going to look, moving on from this, is advising on the donor journey with Rennie chairing, I think. So I'm really looking forward to that one too. So have a lovely week and see you all next week.